Time now for another episode of the Weekly Word with Professor Stephen Hines and Jason Spees. This week, we're joined by energy researcher Sue Mickley.
Well, it's time to put the booze down.
Over the past few months, I've told you about how unbelievable hatch coaching is. Don't just take my word for it. Listen to what Christy Huber, president of the United Way of Cast Clay, says about hatch coaching.
I think it's a really exciting time for our young leaders today because leaders like Eric Hatch are changing the face of what it means to lead an organization or what it means to lead a brand. He's changing that. For many years, I think that the gold standard of leadership has been somebody who is very polished and has it all together or seemingly has it all together. And throughout the years, I think that we've now, especially with technology and social media, we are drawn to what's real.
To find out more about Hatch Coaching or to have Eric Hatch speak at your event or company, visit hatchcoaching.com. That's hatchcoaching.com. Or call 701-212-1572. That's 701-212-1572. Sue Mickley, let's start off a little bit by a little bit of an overview of your involvement in the energy industry, if you would, please.
Well, sure. My background is public health, and I've done research for over 30 years, looking at community trends and then identifying community needs. And in Pennsylvania here, we had a huge change in industry with the development of not unconventional natural gas drilling, which is in the Marcellus Shale play. And what's happened is over half the state now has the opportunity for this, and quite a lot of wells have been drilled in a short period of time, over 8,000. That gave an opportunity in basically a virgin area of the country to see what that impact of that industry was on health.
And this, of course, is this study here that's been in the news recently, talking about how some of the previous reports were a little exaggerated. Did I kind of, I guess, summarize and read between the lines of a bullet point on that, or am I not seeing it, I guess?
No, we're constantly identifying and seeing in the people who don't want to see this industry develop and mature are fighting it with pick and choose kind of reports and studies. We just recently had one released about the same time mine was, about saying that babies born closer to fracked wells have a higher incidence of low birth weight. So, these things that just pick apart a small population, they try to go after the population that is most vulnerable to say, we can't hurt these. But I was able pretty much to show that their numbers are very much in question. Their study is very much in question. And it was done by a bunch of economists. So, yes, they know how to do a lot of math, but I'm not sure they understood looking at health data.
So you were saying that the study that was dictating health results was done by a bunch of economists?
The one specifically to the infants, yes. And they actually critique their own study in a very harsh way when you look at the caveats they list. It's on page 6 of their report. And I'd like to summarize them real quick what they say. We had a limitation of available data, and we were constrained to focus on potential exposure to pollution, but never determined real exposure. That was one. The second one, they started with the whole population of Pennsylvania births, but ended up with a relatively small sample of children who were potentially exposed. Potentially exposed, again, is another word that they keep saying. The third caveat is that the pathway of exposure was not a subject of our study and is not known with certainty. Yeah, they kind of blow their own study up. The fourth one is that to the extent... I know, I'm sorry.
I read those, and I'm just sitting there and thinking, and they got such coverage given, and you can tell that nobody read them.
Nobody reads the fine print, unfortunately. You can put a good title on anything, and it's going to get press, but that doesn't mean it's accurate. So their fourth caveat is, to the extent that there are economic benefits of fracking that accrue to women who live live close to the fracked wells, our estimates could understate the effects of fracking exposure on human health. Well, that doesn't make sense. It should be the opposite, which my study proved.
So, also I might add, Sue, if they don't have a good headline, the people, places like the New York Times, they invent one for them.
I agree. I totally agree. So back to my study, one of the things, the only criticism really that they have produced on it is that it was funded by industry. Everybody gets funding from somewhere, but to guard against bias, I drew my data from the Pennsylvania State Health Department. I did not produce my data. It is factual data that's been collected for decades in a format that is dictated by the CDC. A lot of states collect their data this way, and we've looked at Texas also. I looked at Texas a few years ago. The key is that we needed 10 years of experience to really see what was happening with mortality rates in these communities. So I didn't play with data. I didn't do a lot of formulas around it. It's a simple reporting of what the trends were as the state has provided.
To me, this seems like...
I was looking at it, Sue, and we'll talk about this in a second, because she has done work down in Dallas, Fort Worth earlier, which I think was a prelude to this study right now. But one of the things, it really highlights, Jason, the division now between a few people who, I don't know, I guess are associated with right-wing, and whether it's the Washington Examiner or the Heartland, or you can name them, and they're all considered sort of right-wing wig nuts, and therefore they don't have to be listened to. One, and two, if any study is done by the private sector, immediately is discounted, if not thrown in the garbage can. Although, if you were to require of universities or professors or any environmental group to provide a list of their funding, it would make you sick. So one of the things I have been arguing for, Sue, for some time now, I was going to send it to you this morning, but I just sort of got wrapped up in a couple of things. But I've been calling now for over a year for full disclosure by everybody who does a study.
Oh, that would be really good. I believe that. And that should be the first thing you read before you read a study.
Exactly. And it's, they don't even, not only do they not put it at the front, they don't put it at the back. And one of my favorite little stories about, how this is done in kind of a very surreptitious way. When the EPA was formulating their clean power plan, the first economic benefit study they did only showed about $8 million worth of value, and that was for pregnant women who ate fish from Lake Michigan.
Yeah.
And they admitted this project, the clean power plan, was going to cost a minimum of $8 or $9 billion. Anyway, they hired the University of Syracuse, Harvard University, and a couple other smaller schools, and they had a study done called the indirect benefits of the clean power plant, health benefits. So they released it, and of course, you'd be shocked to know that it came out saying that there was going to be $33 billion worth of value, indirect health value. So anyway, as our group sort of started unraveling, we find out that there are 100 pages of emails between Charles Driscoll, who headed up the study from Syracuse and Harvard. There were communications between EPA and their study groups 6 months before they started the study, the entire length of when they did the study, and also after they got through with the study. And while in the news, Charles Driscoll is being interviewed because it was considered a earth-shaking study. He said, "We don't have any dog in there, horse in this race." As it turns out, between Harvard and Syracuse and Charles Driscoll, they received $49 million in grants.
That's a lot of money.
Well, and it's very symptomatic of what we're seeing right now and have been for several years, since the environment and information and of course health have become politicized. And I like your expression, by the way, unconventional energy. That I want to start using it instead of fracking. Let's take back that term. I think that's the right way to go. But anyway, I think if you would talk with Jason and me about your previous work in Dallas and Fort Worth, because it really is some of lay the groundwork for what you've done in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, actually, when I did the Dallas-Fort Worth research, we were in the throes of fighting what's called the Delaware River Basin Commission here that was working really hard, with the antis to ban fracking in the basin. It's been a real fiasco here with that. So I did that one on my own. I had no funding. I actually wanted to know, for my own peace of mind, if I was going to be an advocate for unconventional gas drilling, that I would really be truly informed whether it would help or hurt the communities. So I went in and I looked at the Fort Worth area because I came to know that they had 1,000 wells drilled with unconventional gas drilling in the city limits. And then I looked at the surrounding counties immediately surrounding the city where there was a lot of activity. And I found the same results, even despite the fact they had a huge increase in elderly, which we had in these 6 counties in Pennsylvania. They still had their mortality rates go down on the indices collected by the state health departments, which are basically 6 indices regarding the primary health reasons for mortality. And in Dallas-Fort Worth, the same thing happened over their 10-year period when the process started there. Now, think about it. The city of Fort Worth with 1,000 wells that were drilled and produced within city limits. And I haven't seen any news reports that said people are dropping over dead. I just got out there. And I spoke with a couple mother-daughter that lived out there. Just one day I met them in another venue, and they said, we just think you guys are silly. Like, this whole thing you guys are doing is, the antis are just silly because we have no problem with it down here.
Well, it's kind of staggering. And by the way, you know this, the Delaware Basin is the battle goes on. We had Jim Willis, who I think you know from Pennsylvania on our previous program, who I've gotten to know over the last 3 years. He's printed 4 or 5 of my pieces, and we've communicated, talked, and emailed and all of that. And he really was, in a sense, had the same frustration, but for him, he's had to deal with the politics in Pennsylvania on this issue, and the stridency of some of the anti-groups. As he pointed out to Jason and me, there were a lot of the same people from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, were out for the DAPL protests.
It's definitely duplicate images when you look at the photos of the protesters, no matter where it is in the state. You see an awful lot of familiar faces. They latch on to Hollywood, stars to tell their cause like they're real scientists. And, it's been really a crazy ride. And we actually were the ones that gave Josh Fox, the director, whatever, of Gasland movies, his motivation to produce his documentaries, which I say documentaries tongue-in-cheek. But the bottom line is he was right down the road from us up in that area in northeast PA, and the Flaming Faucet deal that he shows in that movie that got such dramatic coverage in the news is something that's happened up there for over 70 years. There was a woman we met who, as a child, had told us that when the kids went to school, they would race to see who could get there first, because the first one there got to light the faucet and burn off the methane. And it's a natural occurrence up there. It's a huge coal bed area for and it's shallow methane. We have a lake. We could put a bucket on the lake and for about 20 minutes and then tilt it up a little bit, upside down bucket, tilt it up a little bit and light a match. and that bucket would fly in the air. That has nothing to do with natural gas drilling. That's way different, but he got his breath out of it.
Well, there's another story about Josh Fox. I traced it down. California, the environmental community, state community in Colorado had heard about this so-called documentary coming up, Gasland. And they wrote Josh Fox and called up his whatever agent, and they said, listen, we've done a very careful study on some methane gathering and in places, like you said, that were sort of had significant methane in them. And we've done a very lengthy study, and we'd like to sit down with Josh and go through our research before he does his movie. And guess what happened? I'm sure you know what happened, Sue. He just refused. I mean, it confused his narrative. Well, he didn't really want to know, somebody who took a scientific approach, and these were very sophisticated people from Colorado, who handed him an opportunity to educate himself, and it just didn't fit his narrative.
No, to put it in a nutshell, he's not a scientist, and he has absolutely no interest in being peer-reviewed.
So let me just bring up something I thought was really important, Sue, that you said was that he was looking for the money shots, essentially. He was looking at ways to pull at the heartstrings of people through either sensationalism or just like I was saying, the money shot. You're looking for certain things. And when you talked about, if you look at the DAPL pipeline protesters and some of the other pipeline protesters, it's the same people. It's the same people from thing to thing. Now, when I put those two together, layer those two things together, because I love to do critical thinking, what I see, and when I see the way the DAPL pipeline protest, what happened in North Dakota, they are almost antagonizing industry to get them to do these things that are bigger than life, or that so that they appear to be the victims when in fact they are the aggressors. Does that make any sense?
Oh, absolutely. There's 2 points I want to make that are really important here to know the story. Number one, the first 6 months that the smallest beginning group of antis happened in our area, which grew and grew and grew over time because they got a lot of press, and I'll tell you where the money came from in a minute. But they never talked about water or pollution in the first 6 months that they were active. They never talked that way. They only said they didn't want it in their area. And that's the crux of it. We're back to, I don't want it in my backyard. And I'll find any way I can to fight it. The second thing, if you looked at Selim's movie that he did covering this whole thing that grew into a problem, and we had the distortion of truth in Josh's movies, and then he followed the family that said their well was contaminated, and he confronts her on the public street, and she's talking to him from inside her car and says to him, "You don't know who you're talking to. I am going to stick the NRDC on you." Well, that was like, what? You look up the NRDC, and there is almost $300 million sitting in their coffers, and they were financing this whole thing.
They have $2 billion, and I've seen that footage. It is remarkable. But what is it called? I'm trying to remember. It's
National Resource Defense Council. It's a bunch of lawyers out of New York City.
I belong to them.
And they have over 1 million members. So what happens is they're supposed to defend the environment and all that, but they actually had a case in Indiana, from my understanding, that they were defending somebody's rights to access their mineral rights in gas drilling. So they covered themselves all different ways from Sunday, but their money flows through a lot of other organizations that it makes it look like 1 million organizations are fighting this, but it's all coming a lot of it's all coming from them.
And I couldn't agree more. In fact, I've said for a long time that the mechanism that the environmentalists have created is really quite a corporate machine, really, at the end of the day. And one of the things that is big time fuel for them is trying to be the victim and trying to reposition the narrative so that they're the ones who are taking on, the big bad wolf, so to speak, when a lot of times what they're fighting is communities. They're really fighting communities, but because the communities are based on energy or oil and gas, they're able to shift that narrative to the original big bad wolf or the old big bad wolf type of a thing. Well, I'd like to just bring up the Dakota Access Pipeline once again, because I was very familiar with that, and we're, of course, dealing with some of the blowback from that. I wanted to get your perspective of somebody who's experienced protests before, a lot of the same group of people, and also just the public perception, because our perception, and I've heard this a few times throughout the state, the way that the state of North Dakota and the leaders in the state handled it set the oil and gas industry back decades in terms of public relations, because you had one of the biggest pipeline protests in the nation happen with wounded veterans coming to help out, and Hollywood, and it became a chic thing to do. They shot rubber bullets at the protesters, sprayed water and hypothermic temperatures type of thing, and to where the PR was not good, is what I'm saying. And a lot of people walked away from that and went, boy, you didn't really need to do that. What was it like, the perception from where you were at out in Pennsylvania? How did you experience these types of protests?
I do have to say it's been civil. We haven't had the level of confrontation that you experienced out there. Ironically, I actually went to a powwow before that huge protest happened, and one of the representatives of the Native American tribe actually stood up and said, in an introduction, and then he added this in, I don't have the authority of my elders to say this, but please, I can't remember the exact word he used, but something in the line of pray or support us in our fight against this pipeline. Now, the key word is I don't have the authority of my elders to say this. It kind of clued me in that maybe this wasn't how the whole nation felt, and later on, there was more press about that, little tweaks in between. It wasn't coming from the nation. It was coming from a small group and then outsiders who came and brought the fight to, from the nation, from America to that nation in that area. It was an interesting twist that I was present when that gentleman said that. And it just kind of opened my eyes to the play that was going on to just do another fight and get more national news. I understood some of their concerns, but we all know the facts weren't being portrayed at a national level that, were real, and we didn't see the reality of all that. And yes, I guess the reaction could have been a little harsh, but these things do get out of hand, and they want it to. They want that press. They want that exposure.
Well, a little bit of a prelude to continuing this conversation. First of all, Jason's been doing the Bakken. He owns the Bakken.com website. He is an award-winning journalist. He's done this radio show called The Crude Life or Building the Bakken. I don't know how long, Jason, 8 years, 9 years. He broadcasts in, I think, 31 on 31 stations there. But because North Dakota is a small state, and it was really small before the unconventional oil drilling started. So everybody knows everybody. I think the population went from 300,000 somewhere over 500,000 now. But Jason has actually sits down with the governor about once a month, and on the air. This is not sort of behind the scenes. He interviews everybody within state government who does environmental issues, clean water. He knows the tribes. One of the interesting things that Jason brought up to me was that I think it's 22 or 23% of all the unconventional oil available in North Dakota is owned by the tribes.
Ironic, right?
So I mean, I'm going to use this line because it's the reason why I divorced my second wife. I was talking to her something about a fact, and she started yelling at me, facts, facts, stupid facts. Don't bother me with the stupid facts.
Great.
It's really kind of where we are right now. That if it doesn't fit the narrative, and that is something like your study. Now, I listened to your interview yesterday, and I couldn't. Well, first of all, I was very impressed by both the people that you were talking with, but also you. But one of the things that sort of came out on this whole matter was, as you try, and there were, you might take a look at them, Jason, because they're sponsored by Cabot Oil. But it was just sort of an eye opener. One last thing, and I've got a lot to say, but I won't do it to you now. One last thing I noticed in the media is that Sierra Club and NRDC are asking for the upcoming hearings on the Delaware Basin that they come up with more dramatic presentations in costumes for those hearings.
And they probably will. I mean, that wouldn't surprise me at all.
Well, and I think what happens is you guys really are alluding to what I think is a big point, which I personally wish the oil and gas industry would engage more in, which is trying to humanize the industry a little more. We made a conscious choice, at least on our program, to do more of the community-based soft news stories, partly because, our radio program was a weekend show, and, you're not going to get into the hard news, so you do more of the feature-type things, which I love. I mean, I came from the magazine world and the news magazine feature world. I love doing those types of stories. You stay out of the whole politics of things, and that sort of thing. And really, what we've tried to do is humanize the industry. And oil and gas has made a living for 100 and some years, actually probably 200 years now, on facts, on science, because that's really, at the end of the day, you're breaking rocks. And so I honestly think that the oil and gas industry, as they reinvent their business plan due to the vertical, the horizontal and the vertical drilling, essentially, they are rewriting their business plans. I think they got to look at that human side of things, because that is what the environmental protesters do. They try to, like I say, shift the narrative to humanize it. And as you know, your ex-wives said, Steve, facts, 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 put me to sleep. Tell me a story that'll tug my heart, and then you'll get my interest, And Sue, I'd like to put that ball in your court a little bit. What do you make of that maybe the oil and gas industry needs to look at humanizing things, not get away from the facts, but kind of look at it a different way to position the facts?
Oh, I totally agree, because you can't get the normal average American who's not intimately involved in this development and the impact of it to understand the human side unless you bring it down to a level they can relate to. So that can be personal stories, or it can be the kind of facts that they can say, I get it now. And that's where my report was focused. It's an I get it now facts. Coming from the state, showing the trend, showing that in essence, this is preventing deaths in communities, substantial deaths, and reducing that mortality in critical areas, both for children and through the general population, and a lot for the elderly. So, we're at a stage now where the baby boomers are aging into their final years, and they see these numbers, they can say, wow, these guys are doing great in the areas where the drilling is allowed. Now you look at an area like Northeast PA, which has the same resource, and they're not getting that. What does that mean for those people in that community? It means there are a lot of people who have passed away prematurely because they couldn't access this resource. And it all goes back to economics.
All the economics, all the things that resource brought. It brought the ability. I noticed that the average amount of money every person made in those areas went up significantly. The health care improved.
The unemployment went down.
Children.
Yes.
So here's one thing I was going to bring up, Jason, with Sue's conversation yesterday. She mentioned she made a presentation. Her presentation of her report. It's not a study. It's a report.
The Texas one, the one I did in Texas.
in front of people, including environmentalists. And they couldn't quibble over a single thing with you. Why? Because you brought it down to the ground level using commonly available facts accumulated by a nonpartisan entity known as the states. There was no place to go and say, hey, you got this wrong. And that's really two things, Jason, getting back to this. One, we have to, and I really encourage you, Sue, to continue this work because it's so vital. We need to take back this discussion. But the other thing, and going to what you were saying, Jason, one of the things, I was talking with Nicole Jacobs yesterday, who you know, Sue. She's with Energy in Depth. And I was saying the very same thing that Jason is, they don't do a very good job of publicizing what they do. And I thought, well, you can't really they gave away $5,000 for kids' clothing. What the strategy really should center around accumulating a bunch of really good behavior and then issue it all at once. Secondly, they should go out to the cities who receive these benefits and interview them and include their quotes in their press release and in their stories. How did it affect the people that receive the beneficence of corporate America and the oil industry, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
That I totally agree with, because I think when you get down to the communities and really talk to the people who are experiencing these thriving economies that have changed their world, you will find those stories.
Well, so it is. I guess who was I talking to yesterday? It might have been. We talked with Paul Dreesen yesterday, who is a name you may not know, but he's a very well-respected writer. Published a couple of books, including Eco Imperialism, written in the Wall Street Journal a lot. But I was going through this little vignette when I worked for a high-efficiency lighting company before I retired, and we did warehousing, distribution centers, large-scale stuff. So we did. For example, we did 500 locations for Coca-Cola. $50 million project. Why did they do it? Because it paid for itself in a year. Anyway, as a part of my marketing effort on behalf of my company, which went from 11 employees to 350 employees before we went public, I created an environmental stewardship award, and every time we did a project in another city, I wrote up a news release. I presented this plaque which designates how much energy they were saving, because lighting you can prove, you can verify that, and also the environmental impact. And I released it to their city's media. Tell your story through other people. It is more believable. And when Coca-Cola, I started that program for Coca-Cola. They held a press conference in Southern California, brought in the governor and newspapers and a couple TV stations came there for them to demonstrate the effect of new lighting, and one, that you could prove it was using less energy, and two, it had higher light levels. It's not that complex.
Right. I would like to cover, I've already talked about all the death indices went down in these areas over the 10-year period, even longer. I looked before drilling and I carried it to 2014. But I want to discuss the infant from what I found in the state data. And in my report itself, Figure 11 talks about infant mortality rates. And in the top Marcellus counties, those 6 counties, which, by the way, had 87% of the unconventional gas wells drilled in their area, the infant mortality rate went down 21% compared to the state of 14.7% decline. So you can see there's enough there to say definitely these counties improved on the infants. And the death rates went down, but also we had a higher fertility rate on average in almost all these counties. And the percent of births to teenagers, 18 and younger, went down significantly. In some cases, there wasn't even enough data to evaluate once it had reached 2014. And the percent of low birth weight in these counties when you don't get as specific as they did with such a small sample size, that also went down consistently or stayed the same. So,
or the weights went up. I mean, isn't that another way of saying it, right, Sue?
no, when you're looking at percentage of low birth weight babies, there's a mark that they believe is low birth weight. So you're looking at the number of babies born, whether they went up or down. And yes, I guess you could say the average weight then probably went up. But yes, like in Tioga, it went from 7% to 5.1%. It stayed the same in Washington. It stayed the same in Susquehanna from the beginning of the study to the end. A lot of interim years it went down substantially. Lycoming went up a little. Greene went down a little. And Bradford went down. The state of Pennsylvania went from 7.7 to 8.3, so they didn't have a lot of movement in that. So these counties actually exceeded the experience that the state had. And that's good. That means these babies, so what that means is lower death, the infant birth weights stay somewhat stable or decline, but that also means these babies are surviving rather than dying. And there you get back to the personal impact of this. They're surviving. These parents have their children now. And that's significant.
Well, and as you pointed out, the senior citizens have ticked up significantly. Their lifespan has ticked up significantly. Why? Because of better economic development. They have better access. They have better health care. They have better access to health care.
Oh, yes. In one of the areas, they actually built a new hospital. They were able to build a new hospital because of the changes in their community. And completely modern update, brought in, instead of having things like imaging brought in on semi-trucks, it's in the facility now. That's key to good health care. That's really important. And these are rural areas. They didn't have that kind of service before.
You know, it's funny you bring that up because I was telling people I traveled quite a bit across the different shale plays, and I'd say, you know, if you go into a town of a population between, say, 30,000 and 100,000, you have some major investments going into their hospitals. Like, they are not only adding floors and wings, in some cases, they're just building brand new state-of-the-art hospitals. So what you're saying to me makes a lot of sense, because one of the things we like to do is layer in things here. And if you have this economic development going in, and one of the stories I did out in the Bakken was the foundation of a community, and we were talking about the different roads, on how a lot of the energy companies didn't wait for the government. They just went and built their own roads up to code just to make sure that they could get things going on certain arteries and that sort of thing. And then the other thing was the healthcare side. That was one of the big early investments right away, from either a public-private investment side of things, or it's energy companies donated tons of money, or in some cases the hospital just knew they had to play ball to get to the point, because you need a healthy baseline for there. That is really cool that you guys are recognizing the ripple effects that it has through all the other demographics just by the sheer investment of oil and gas into an economy.
Well, and the other thing is, going on where you were just for a second, Jason, not only that, we hear everybody's wringing their hands about new infrastructure, although they continue to fight pipelines and transmission lines. And what is happening in those places with unconventional oil? The private sector is investing money, enormous amounts of money. In many cases, it has no state money, no tax money at all. It's being paid by the private sector. Why are they doing it? Well, it's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of self-interest, and it's also a little bit of contributing to the place where their employees live, which is great PR for any company.
I'd like to follow up on that. When I was first delving into all of this, National Geographic did a wonderful story about the critical nature of our national grid, and they gave estimates of what it would cost to bring it up to par to meet our energy needs as the population boom continues to happen in America and basically throughout the world. But they were specifically talking America. And it was really an astronomical amount of money. If you look at and that's public funds, so there again our national debt goes up and our, taxes go up to cover that. If you look at natural gas, again, like you just said, it is an infrastructure being financed by the industry. It's not coming out of the pockets of our taxpayers. And yet it's servicing our taxpayers and bringing a very inexpensive resource to the communities. That's really important to look at.
Well, especially if you heard any of the news about this remarkable Wild West run on oil and fracking and all unconventional gas in North Dakota. So there are sort of horror stories out there, and overblown horror stories where they had to bring in mobile homes and people would live in a different state and drive to work every day. But in some ways, the blessing, that sort of that period between 2014 and this last year, everybody in North Dakota caught up. So the schools caught up, the roads caught up, residences caught up. In some ways, they really have taken a city or a state that was really, it didn't have as much money to do those kind of projects as they would have liked to, and all of a sudden now they're done. They don't.
And aren't they in an enviable position compared to so many other places in the country? And I want to pinpoint an area that has broken my heart, which is what's called the southern tier of New York State. They have a lot of that resource up there. They were one of the first places in the world to drill natural gas and actually use it in a community back, hundreds of years ago. And now they're a death zone up there. For example, the city of Elmira lost 40% of their population. Binghamton, I was up there talking to people, and I actually invested in the house thinking that would be a real hub of activity for the trains bringing in supplies for the drilling. They had 45,000 vacant homes up there. Beautiful old homes, workers' homes and old IBM, support homes and things like that. They were all brought in the old days when that was a thriving area. The places are dead zones now. It's so sad. And they're under the thumb, the thumb of a political system that just will not save them. So one of the gentlemen I met, he said every single family member of his, 36 people, have left the state. He's the only one that's staying because he's a plumber and he was so close to retiring. He said, I can't start over. But he said, as soon as I retire, I'm leaving too. And that story you hear over and over. You go around the communities and there are tarps on their roofs because they can't afford to fix the roofs.
Well, I have a friend who has a house up in the Adirondacks, and he's a Wall Street person, so it isn't a shabby house. Yeah, they call it a hunting cabin that's about 11,000 square feet. But I drive through all, upstate New York. I lived in New York City for 12 of the last 30 years in Manhattan. I've gone upstate a lot, and it's like going into parts of the South, the poor South. And they are sitting there, other than a few towns that live off of, people coming into the area for the summer. They are really just sitting on this enormous amount of oil for both the Utica and the Marcellus, and Albany and the mayor and the governor will not let them even do a sampling of demonstrating how safe this whole process of unconventional oil has become.
Okay, but the thing that's behind, you always have to follow the money on everything. And where I found this motivation for the state to fight natural gas drilling is in Niagara Falls. You guys know what Niagara Falls produces?
Hydro.
Yeah, a lot of electricity. So right as we were looking at, all the influx of companies wanting to lease land and start developing our areas, New York was on board with that too. We had a lot of landowner alliance groups talking to the different companies. But at the same time, New York State invested a huge amount of money revamping all those generators. And then they were, they upped the fees for electricity. New York State, with that natural resource, I think it's the second or third highest electric rates in the country. Yep. Where all that money goes, I'll never know. But they sell to Canada. They're in a partnership with Canada, but they basically sell to Canada too. So they've got a huge base of people buying that electricity. And, you know, what do they want natural gas to come in and compete with them? Absolutely not.
Boy, I tell you, that is a great point. So let's kind of wrap up here things a little bit and kind of get into our final thoughts. Sue, we'll let you kind of start what you want people to remember. If we miss something that you think we should quickly bring up, or if you have something you want to reiterate. So I'll just kind of let you have the floor, and then we'll kind of hand it over to the Professor Hines from there.
I just want to reiterate that we're looking at something that could absolutely be a game changer for communities. It could help farmers keep their lands intact. They can pass them on in future generations. So, you know, all these environmentalists talk about the environment. Talk about open spaces being protected. That's big. Talk about health care being improved for so many people. Talk about invigorating economies that are in the dead zone, that literally are struggling to even survive day to day. It's just, to me, it's criminal that the games are being played to manipulate this whole arena against this resource and against the people that own the resource, which are the landowners.
Great point. Well, Jason, you know, we've covered an awful lot of territory. I will highlight a couple of points. Because only about approximately half of the states even have anything to frack. You have really a divided country, and it's sort of a New York attitude. If you don't have it under you, what's it got to do with me? So all of a sudden, you have little or no interest politically in those states that don't have anything to frack. Although Jim Willis pointed out that everybody uses energy and electricity and plastics, which is another byproduct of unconventional oil drilling. So in some ways, it's almost built to be somewhat separate, split personality. And also when you throw in, as Jason was saying earlier, it's a very sophisticated set of environmental groups who have more than 300 million. Really, Sue, you're talking billions of dollars between the NRDC. They have over EDF, Sierra Club, and they are using it. One last thing, and then I'm going to be quiet, at least for this show, Jason. A perfect vignette. Over in the Delaware Basin, Sierra Club is backing one landowner who they had talked into going into court against any development in and around his property. As it turns out, the oil company came in and made a deal with this one person, and all of a sudden, in an appeals court, the Sierra Club had no standing. Why? Because they didn't represent anybody.
I agree. The RBC is a rogue organization. They are not voted in by the public. They're voted in by the governors of each state. There are 4 states, and the majority of those states, and the Army Corps of Engineers, the 5th member, more than the majority of those states have no skin in the game for natural gas drilling. New Jersey, Delaware, and the Army Corps of Engineers. New York has it, and we know how New York thinks. So poor Pennsylvania is alone in this. Well, right now, our governor is not even helping us there, but for the most part, Pennsylvania is all alone. And we're the only one that has historically paid all our dues to that organization, where a majority of the other members have not. In fact, they've been in arrears quite substantially for a long time. Yet we don't have a say.
Ohio might, they slowly, and they're as political as Pennsylvania, but Ohio, because they're building so many natural gas power plants, all of a sudden it's no longer a debate over pipelines. They have to have the pipelines. And they are sitting on a bunch of natural gas themselves. So in some ways, and I think, well, one last thing. There was a very famous song by Bruce Springsteen back in the 1980s called Youngstown. And there was a song about a city that had been an industrial powerhouse and now was going to nothing. Well, guess what? It's been transformed. One, because they are sitting on some natural gas, but 2, because they're such a good manufacturer, they're making steel there again, and they're making equipment for the fracking industry.
Oh, yeah, this could invigorate industry. It absolutely has started doing that in a wonderful way for America, and it's going to get better and better as this resource becomes more prolific to support industry. I mean, we all know that's happening. That's a given.
All right. Well, how can people support your organization there? Let's get into final plugs, and then I've got to call the time on this thing. So, Sue, start. How can people support your cause and your organization?
Well, we're with energyanddeath.org, and my report can be found on their website. And they are definitely a great organization that is an advocate for looking at these kind of scenarios and circumstances and trying to help these communities. They're a great organization, so that's the group.
What's the website again?
Energy and Death, EID, I believe it's called Energy and Death. So you can just research that and you can find their website.
Well, of course.
We're having Steph on tomorrow who has a new report on methane, which will be interesting in its own right.
And, of course, we'll have all those links at our website. So thank you very much for joining us here today. To listen to the full-length interview with energy researcher Sue Bickley, Professor Stephen Hines, and Jason Spees, or to listen to other weekly words, visit thecrudelife.com. That's thecrudelife.com. Once again, I'd like to take this opportunity and thank our sponsors. And I'd like to invite you folks to go to the website, thecrudelife.com, click on our sponsors tab, and see if there's anybody there you might recognize, you might know, you might want to reach out and say hello to, or you might want to do some business with them. We certainly would appreciate that very much. They keep interviews like this for free. Not to mention, they literally keep our lights on. That's going to do it this week, folks. We'll see you next week. For Professor Stephen Hines, my name is Jason Spees, and this has been The Weekly Word. The music on today's program is written and performed by the Moody River Band. To find out more about the Moody River Band or their music, visit our website, thecrudelife.com, and click on the Musician tab. That's thecrudelife.com, and click on the Musicians tab.
Now we're gonna have no trouble with the treble. There's no breaks in the breeze. It's just you and me, baby, singing it like we did in the good old days. Yeah, we're singing it like they did in the good old days, because we're back to the way. Oh, well, you build the bridge and I'll hammer on the harmony. After a hard week's work, we'll